I've been plant-based for, I would say, 30 years. To be honest, more like 40 years, but the first 10 of those years was a slow transition. So, gradually dropped red meat and then slowly, just eating less and less of the animal products. And so it's been 30 years that I can say I've been pretty much entirely plant-based. That happened after I became a dietitian. So I've been a dietitian for 1982, I graduated, 1983. So, 35 years I've been a registered dietitian. So yeah, it happened after. And I can tell you, it was not an easy decision because I had actually only met one real live vegetarian in my life. And it was my grade 8 science teacher. And he was a hippie. He had the long hair, and I thought he was really cool. My dad taught in a classroom opposite him, and he thought it was just absolutely insane that he was eating a vegetarian diet and feeding it to his kids, of all things. So when I made the decision to become completely plant-based, my family didn't exactly do a celebration party. At that time I had a 4-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son, so they were still very, very young. And what triggered it for me, I was actually, at the time, I was a community nutritionist. So my job was teaching Canada's food guide in the 4 food groups, 2 of the 4 of which were animal products. And I mean, I led a nursing moms group. I did, I often spoke on CBC on the radio. I had a column in the newspaper. I just was doing a wide variety of things, but it was really based on the traditional teachings of my profession. And so the decision to make this extreme leap to a plant-based diet was a little concerning because I didn't know if you could be a dietitian and be plant-based. But anyway, what triggered my change was I found myself shifting in a direction of more plant foods, fewer animal foods because of health. I thought it just made sense to me, fiber and all of the wonderful things you find in plants. And it made sense to be eating lentils and tofu instead of red meat. And so I slowly was making that shift. But what actually was kind of the final straw was an interaction I had with my husband's best man at our wedding. He was on his way deer hunting, and he called and he said, "Can I stop by for coffee on my way deer hunting?" And I said, "Sure, no problem." And so and as he's driving over, I'm thinking to myself, how can I make this man feel very guilty about killing another deer? Because I didn't like the idea of hunting. And so when he was visiting, I said to him, I don't understand how you can feel good about going into the woods with your big gun and shooting a beautiful, innocent animal that to me doesn't deserve to die. What did that animal ever do to you? And you call it a sport, but it's like usually in sports both teams have the same equipment. I don't consider it a sport. It just seems mean-spirited. And it was what he said back to me that changed the course of my life. He said, just because you don't have the guts to pull the trigger does not mean you're not responsible for the trigger being pulled every time you buy your piece of meat camouflaged in cellophane in the grocery store. He said, at least the animals I eat have had a life. I wonder if you can say the same for the ones that are sitting on your plate. And I was silenced. I was absolutely silenced because I knew that he was right. And I had never taken responsibility for the food that I was putting in my mouth. And you go to the grocery store and it's so simple. And we don't look beyond that and really understand where our food is coming from. And so after that interaction, I really thought about it and I started researching how we're raising animals and what's involved. And what I learned filled me with shame, guilt, remorse. You know, I was raised as a little kid. I can still remember picking worms off the sidewalk for fear they were going to, you know, dry up after the rain. I used to talk to animals on my way to school. I had a big heart for animals. I can remember being at a bullfight when I was about 3 years old, and you know, it was El Cordobi's the hero of Spain, and we were there, and all of a sudden I realized what a bullfight was, that they were going to kill this bull. And when the bull scored a couple of points or whatever he did, I jumped up on my seat. I mean, you could have heard a pin drop in the entire stadium of 10,000 people. There's this little 3-year-old jumping up and down, yay, bull, go, bull, you know? And so I always had that heart, as I think many children do, but we get desensitized as we grow up and we get removed from our, you know, where the food is really coming from. And so I made a decision at that point, and I thought to myself, I don't want my life to be about contributing to pain, suffering, and death any more than it has to be. I don't need to be a part of this system of cruelty. And, you know, my mom grew up on a farm, and they had names for the animals, and the animals did have a bit of a life until they went to the slaughterhouse or they were killed at the farm, whichever it was. But today, animals don't have a life. They're, you know, 90% are raised in CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. And they, I mean, literally, when you think about the, you know, the pig, for example, they, you know, pigs have been rated to have the intelligence of a 3-year-old child, and dogs about a 2.5-year-old child. And they are very intelligent beings, and yet these pigs that would live 15 years live 6 months in a prison, in a hellish prison that's so bad that they go insane. They, you know, so in order to prevent them from biting one another's tails off in that little stall, they, you know, they cut their, you know, tails off, and they cut their ears, they dock their ears, they cut their genitals off so they don't have as many hormones going on, and all without any anesthetic when they're just little babies. It's just horrendous what we do to these creatures. And I can't justify it. I don't understand how the human race is justifying it. The only thing I can think of is that people have these blinders on because they're just buying this piece of meat at the grocery store. And it's got to stop. We're killing ourselves by eating animals that are, you know, raised in this way. We're eating so much of it, and we're destroying the planet, and we're, you know, causing unthinkable suffering in these creatures for nothing. It's totally unnecessary. And so when I came to that realization, even as a dietitian, I thought, I can't do this. And so I went to my husband of about 10 years at that time. We had been married about 10 years, and I said to him, would you be willing to become a vegetarian? Well, he'd never even met a real live vegetarian. I mean, he didn't have the same science teacher I did. And he said, I thought you'd never ask. I'd love to be a vegetarian. He said, I've always wanted to live a lifestyle that would leave a softer footprint on the planet, and I can't think of a better way of doing that. So I thought to myself, boy, I married pretty young, but I married pretty well. So it worked out very nicely. Well, I can tell you that the dietetic profession 30 years ago, I'll even go a step further back. When I was in university, and again, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, I learned 2 things about vegetarian nutrition in school. One was that vegetarian diets were risky and should never be fed to children or pregnant or lactating women. And vegan diets were downright dangerous. Nobody should be eating them, period. That's pretty much all I learned. So you can imagine 5 or 6 years later in practice, the sentiment hadn't shifted a lot. So the idea of a dietitian being not only, vegetarian, but pretty much vegan was almost unheard of. As a matter of fact, I didn't know if I was the only vegan dietitian on the planet. And it was scary. I thought I might be ousted from the profession. But I considered, another profession. I thought, do I need to leave? But I thought, if everybody who starts to see a bigger picture, the ethical picture, the environmental picture, even the recommendations of the World Health Organization at the time, that a lot of North Americans weren't very familiar with. If everybody who started to see these things just exited the profession, I thought, it will take much longer to affect change within the profession. I thought, I've got to have the courage to stay and to speak with some knowledge, and I need to make sure that I am very, very well versed with the literature. I need to be very professional in what I do, and I just need to stay. And I wanted so desperately to help people who were choosing a plant-based diet to do it well. I thought, I know enough from my education that I can help people to design diets that work really well. Because to me, a failed vegetarian or a failed vegan is really exhibit number one for why everybody around them is justified in eating meat. They kind of prove you need meat to be healthy. And so I was really determined to try to help change that. And when I moved to, within a year or two of becoming plant-based, I moved to Vancouver from Northern Ontario. Northern Ontario is kind of hunting, fishing, beer and bingo kind of crowd. And no, wonderful people, don't get me wrong, just wonderful, wonderful people, but that more of that mentality, whereas Vancouver, much more veg friendly. I thought, I'm gonna meet real live vegetarians for the first time in my life. So we moved there, and you wouldn't believe, the first few dietitians I met two. One was moving towards plant-based, the other one was a Seventh-day Adventist vegetarian. So I learned that there actually was more than even one other vegetarian dietitian on the planet. So within fairly short order, I met another one, Vasanto Molina, who became my writing partner. And we began writing books together. And at the first book, we had a third author as well, Victoria Harrison. But Vasanto and I went on, and we've written now many books together. I'm on my ninth. I think she's on her 12th or 13th. We just are completing 2 more this year. And so we've been providing the resources we believe people need. And Vasanto is actually the senior author on the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position statement on vegetarian nutrition as well. So I was a past president of the vegetarian arm of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So we've been very active within our professions. And as for the shift, at first, our peers were a little, skeptical, but they were inviting us to speak, to see what we had to say. And I can remember feeling that we've really arrived when a few years ago I was speaking at Dietitians of Canada, and one of the leaders, the CEOs, I was doing an interview like this, and after the interview, she came up to me with a little gift, and she said, I just want to tell you how proud you make me to be a dietitian. Thank you for the work you've been doing for the last many years. And it just made me feel so validated, and it made me feel like what I've been doing is not just helping vegetarians, but helping my fellow colleagues as well, who are really coming along. And then my writing partner, Vasanto, this year won, I shouldn't say this year, last year, 2017, won the highest award offered to only one person a year from Dietitians of Canada, the Riley Jeffs Memorial Lecture Award, for her work over the past 30 or 40 years. And so it's our profession. Many people think dietitians are in the dark ages still, but it's really quite extraordinary the number of new young dietitians that are graduating as plant-based dietitians, and also the number of older dietitians that are interested. I can remember once speaking at the American, it was at that time the American Dietetic Association, but at the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and I was in a room and speaking on vegetarian nutrition, and there was room for 900 people in that room. There were so many people there that I bet we had 300 people on the floor and 200 people out the door. And I was told when I went to pick up my little CD of the lecture, it was the second biggest selling CD of the entire conference. And so there's interest, and we as people that are especially interested in plant-based, a more plant-based world, don't discount that physicians, even mainstream dietitians, are interested in this, this option for people. It's really happening. One of the great advantages of a plant-based diet is it is less energy intensive. It demands less of our very precious resources, including water. It reduces problems with reduced biodiversity, desertification, deforestation, species extinction, and there are many reasons for that. But if you look at, a lot of people think this is, sort of out there environmental groups that might be saying these things, but in fact in 2010 and 2015, the latest paper, I think it was either 2017 or just out in 2018, a group called the United Nations Environmental Program has been saying that the two biggest factors in climate change are animal agriculture and transportation. And what we know is animal agriculture is even more significant than all forms of transportation combined. Just slightly so, but still, most people would just be stunned by that. And in fact, they said that their recommendation for the entire planet was a global shift towards a plant-based diet. There was an award-winning study done in, I think it was 2008, at Carnegie Mellon University. They won the environmental study of the year. They showed that you would reduce greenhouse gas emissions more by eating vegan 1 day a week than by eating 100% local 7 days a week, 24/7, just 1 day a week. My son he did environmental studies at university, and I can remember in his 4th year, he called me after class and he said, "Mom, you're not going to believe this. We had to calculate our carbon footprint today." And he said, "I beat everyone in the class by a mile." And they were all shocked because they do these 2-minute showers and ride their bike to school. And I live far enough from school that I'm driving a car. And I still came out way lower than them. And everybody was like, sir, that's not fair. How come his is? And the professor said to the class, "Read my lips. He doesn't eat meat." And you need to get that. And it's hard to be an environmentalist truly when you're consuming animal products because they require so many resources in their production. In fact, the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a study came out in 2016 saying that if we all continue on this path, looking at what would be expected, sort of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, well, if everybody instead adopted sort of the diet the World Health Organization is recommending, a diet that's higher in fruits and vegetables, lower in meat and dairy products and sugar, that we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 29% by 2950 compared to doing what we're doing now. But if everyone went vegan, we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 70%. And that's from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So this is not stuff that is really debatable anymore. And in fact, there are a few studies out of California that are worth considering. Even a vegetarian diet with milk and eggs we're looking at, compared to an omnivorous diet with meat, the omnivorous diet takes, 3 times more water. It takes 10 times more, or I think 13 times more fertilizer. It's just, when you funnel, plants through animals, you lose a lot in the process. So much so, in fact, that another study out of California showed that chicken takes about, to produce, we're looking at sort of the energy protein efficiency ratio of animal products in comparison to wheat, for example, or grains. 4 times more to raise chicken, 40 times more to raise beef. So just huge, huge differences. So I think people need to understand that people that really care about the environment, we see all of these people talking about paleo diets and how paleo diets are so wonderful. Well, if everyone ate paleo, just do the math. And Dr. David Katz, who's a leading nutrition authority and professor at Yale, he did the math and he said we would need 15 planet Earths today if everybody on the planet was paleo. We can't, we've got to start to look beyond ourselves and recognize that our choices have consequences. And it just doesn't make sense to be funneling, plant foods through animals when we don't have to. Another thing that I think people should know is during the entire Ethiopian famine back in the 80s, Ethiopia was shipping grains to feed our animals because they had this huge debt to pay. Well, their people are starving to death. Animals require a lot of grains to grow to the size they do, and most of that is lost. It takes, pounds and pounds of grain to produce a pound of meat. And so people that care about the environment and care about leaving, a planet that is intact for their children and grandchildren really need to be considering this. For many, many years, when I was in university, we were told it wasn't safe unless you were an adult, only an adult, and unless you also consumed eggs and dairy products. And so for many dietitians and doctors, and especially in Europe, they're probably 20 years behind where we are in North America in thinking about plant-based diets. And there are position statements all over Europe saying that plant-based diets are not safe and adequate, especially for growing children. So we have a position statement from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, 2016, that says that that vegetarian, including pure vegetarian or vegan diets, are safe and adequate and actually may provide health benefits in disease prevention. They go on to say that they are safe and adequate at every stage of the life cycle, from infancy through childhood, adolescence, during the senior years, for athletes, the works. That there's no life cycle category that they would not be appropriate for if they're appropriately planned. And that's the key. And that's, what my career has been about, is to help people appropriately plan them, because of course there are adequate and inadequate vegetarian diets. Does vegan ensure good nutrition? Absolutely, positively not. Not a chance. So when you think about it, potato chips are vegan, Coca-Cola is vegan, or any other soda. You could be living on junk food. You could be eating white toast with margarine and jam for breakfast, with a soda and French fries with vegan gravy for lunch. You could be eating junk all day long and be in much worse shape than an omnivore eating even a semi-decent diet. So absolutely, positively not. They're, at both ends of the extreme. So you've got sort of the folks that may say, well, all I care about is animal rights or the environment. I'm not that concerned about my health. I'll eat whatever. Well, there's concerns there about nutritional adequacy of the diet. And then on the other end of the spectrum, people that are really rigid, it's whole food, plant-based, but that say, want to be 100% natural, don't think we should need any kind of supplementation at all. They can end up B12 deficient, they can end up vitamin D deficient, they can end up iodine deficient, they can end up with iron deficiency or even zinc deficiency. And so the diet needs to be appropriately planned wherever on the spectrum you lie. So definitely being vegan does not guarantee better health than an omnivore. But that having been said, we know that the average vegan is at some benefit compared to the average omnivore. When people first become vegan, depending on why they've made that choice. So for example, if they're doing it for animal rights or the environment, they may, just simply drop the meat and dairy and continue eating whatever they were eating. So they end up with a diet that's very high in refined carbohydrates. So lots of pasta and lots of bagels and just not, again, a balanced diet. And what we know is when you replace meat with refined carbohydrates, you experience no health benefits whatsoever. One is pretty much as bad as the other. So that's something I think is really important for people to understand. The second mistake I think people make, and of course there are several mistakes to be made, but I think the other mistake is it just simply ignoring the nutrition priorities. So, making sure you've got good sources of all of these nutrients of concern. So when you look at omnivorous diets, there are certain nutrients you don't really worry about, you get plenty of. Sometimes you get too much of. With a plant-based diet, it's different nutrients. And so when you remove meat, you're removing a major source of protein, iron, and zinc. When you remove dairy, you're removing a major source of calcium and vitamin D. So you need to make sure that the plant foods you're eating provide those nutrients. So for example, with removing meat, our richest source of protein and iron and zinc would be legumes. When you remove milk, well, one of the richest sources of calcium would be low oxalate green vegetables. Beans provide some nuts and seeds, and so you need little bits from all of these foods. Vitamin D, well, some plant-based foods are fortified, but if you're eating a whole food diet and you don't use any fortified foods, where's your vitamin D come from? Well, if you get enough warm sunshine throughout the year, you don't have a problem. But most of us live, in places where we don't get adequate warm sunshine throughout the year. I sure don't. I live in Kelowna, British Columbia. Well, our winter months, we get very little sunshine, and even if I'm exposed to sunshine, it's not warm sunshine, it's very cold sunshine. And so we don't produce any vitamin D from probably late October through to March. And so we need to make sure we have a source of that nutrient. So these are the big concerns, I would say. Vitamin B12 deficiency, vegan diets definitely, vegans are at higher risk for B12 deficiency. Now, there's a lot going on here. So what people need to know is vitamin B12 is made by little microorganisms. And we have lots of those microorganisms that produce B12 in our body, but most of them are in our large intestine, and B12 is absorbed mostly in our small, and things don't usually go backwards. So at that point, once they're in the large intestine. So we don't get a lot of B12. If you had really bad oral hygiene, you might have some bacteria in your mouth that produce B12, but you probably don't want to have really bad oral hygiene because it'll cut about 10 years off your life. So we need to have a source of B12. Just a couple of things to be aware of. Plant foods are not reliable sources. because we try to get rid of pathogenic bacteria, we get rid of other bacteria as well. If we fermented foods in dirty vessels, like tempeh in wooden vats that had bacteria between the layers of wood, we might get some. There are some studies from Indonesia, for example, that show tempeh being a B12 source. But in North America, we actually produce tempeh in stainless steel vats that are very clean, and so the amounts of B12 there would be very limited. And some people say, well, what about seaweed? It has B12, and seaweed does have B12. However, there's a combination of true B12 and what we call inactive non-cobalamin coronoids, or B12 analogs, that attach to B12 receptor sites but don't function as B12 and can actually contribute to a functional B12 deficiency. So, and when you dry seaweed, the active B12 some of it at least gets converted into these inactive forms as well. So chlorella may be a source, AFA, there's a few of the blue-green algae may be a source, but we don't have enough good solid evidence to say people can rely on those and only those. So right now, most experts are saying rely on something other than seaweed as your primary B12 source. And so what is that something? You've got two choices: fortified foods, and if you're a whole foods person, you might not be using fortified foods, or you can be using supplements. And if you're using supplements, you need 1,000 micrograms at least twice a week. If you're using cyanocobalamin, if you're using methyl cobalamin or adenosylcobalamin, you may need it more often. 1,000 micrograms a day, because it's a little bit less stable than cyanocobalamin. So we need a source of B12. If we look at all of the studies, I've done searches in the literature to see about B12 status in vegans. The folks that have the highest B12 status are generally omnivores, then lacto-ovo-vegetarians, then vegans, then raw vegans at the bottom of the barrel, because raw vegans aren't using fortified foods. And so they need to include a supplement. And if they're not, they have low status. So we have studies out of Germany, we have studies out of Finland, we have studies out of the United States showing very low levels in a lot of raw vegans. And if that happens, they also have very high homocysteine levels, which can increase risk of cardiovascular disease, which is ridiculous. It's like shooting ourselves in the foot. We're at such an advantage where cardiovascular disease is concerned. We just don't want to ignore B12. It's imperative that we include a source. And it's not difficult. The other thing to know is that the IOM, or the Institute of Medicine, recommends that everyone over 50 not rely on animal products for B12. And the reason being is that in animal products, B12 is bound to protein. And in order to get the B12 off the protein it's bound to, you need to be producing enough stomach acid and enough enzymes to cleave that B12 off so you can absorb it into your bloodstream. And it's estimated 10 to 30% of people over 50 don't. So if you're relying only on animal products for your B12 at that age, there's a possibility you're not actually getting it and you can become quite B12 deficient. And one of the symptoms can be, the beginnings of dementia. So it's not a nutrient to fool around with. If you are a vegan or a raw vegan mom who has a baby and you are B12 deficient, that baby could have irreversible brain damage within a few months of birth. This is not an optional nutrient. It is absolutely necessary for blood cell formation, for the functioning of our nervous system. It's a critical nutrient, and so we just can't ignore it. So we need to be responsible and make sure there is a source in the diet, period. Protein, of course, that is the first question everyone gets asked, is where do you get your protein? Because in our culture, we put animal protein on this kind of pedestal. And it's the protein source. If you're not eating meat and eggs and poultry and fish, how can you get enough protein? And that's what most people really believe. The reality, of course, is different. It is absolutely possible to get enough protein on a plant-based diet. There are really two issues where protein is concerned. One is the issue of quantity. Can we get enough grams of protein? The other is the issue of quality. Is the quality of plant protein sufficient to support sort of the growth of a child, or is it enough to support, muscle building and all of these things? So looking at issue number one, can we get enough protein from a plant-based diet? Well, we can get, again, the answer is absolutely not a problem. We need about 10 to 15% of calories from protein, and that's sort of World Health Organization recommendation, which allows some, there's a little bit of padding there. So 10 to 15%. Well, if you look at the percent of calories from protein in plant foods, what you see is we're right in there. So for example, we get about 15 to 40% of calories from protein from beans and from non-starchy vegetables. So green leafy vegetables, about 15 to 40% of the calories in these foods is coming from protein. And so look at those, and then you look at grains, it's about 7 to maybe 17 or 18% of calories from protein. Nuts and seeds, well, nuts, 5 to 15, seeds probably 12 to 20% of calories from protein. The only categories of plant foods that are under 10% are starchy vegetables at about 8 to 12. So a few starchy vegetables will come in a little bit low. And fruits, which are probably 1 to 10% of calories from protein. So if you eat a mix of whole plant foods and you get enough calories, it's almost impossible not to get enough protein. The only ways that you can really blow it are, number one, by eating a lot of junk. So you eat a lot of oil, which has no protein, a lot of sugar, which has no protein. You get 50% of your calories from oil and sugar, you're not going to get enough protein. But if you're eating whole plant foods, it's just not a problem. The second way of blowing it would be to eat mostly fruit. If all you're eating is fruit, completely fruitarian diet, protein could be an issue. And I've seen people on fruitarian diets where they start to lose their hair, their skin kind of gets, just thinner or something like that. And so we see some protein deficiencies. But generally, if people are eating a variety of food and getting enough calories, which isn't an issue for most North Americans, protein is not a big deal. And then the second part of the equation is quality. And so one of the things that people often say is, well, plant protein is deficient in or limited in essential amino acids, or what we also call indispensable amino acids. And the reality there is that plant foods or plants are actually the sources of essential amino acids. It makes zero sense to think we can't get them from plants. It's where they come from. They all come from plants. Animals have lots of essential amino acids in, a really good amount, but they got them at some point along the food chain from the plants. So we can get them from plants too. And it's true that some plants have a little less, grains have less lysine, and beans may have a little bit less methionine. But the reality is, if we eat a variety of foods over the course of the day, we actually store amino acids in protein pools in our bodies. And so let's say all you eat is lentils at one meal and all you eat is, bread at another meal. You would actually be drawing on, when you eat the bread, you would be drawing on the pools of amino acid to get the extra lysine you need to build the proteins that you need to build. So it's really not a huge issue. Now, the other part of that question is it ever a concern? Can people, eating plant-based diets fall short? And it's a concern for a few groups. Number one, small children. They need more protein. Adults need about 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. If you're eating purely plants, you digest a little less protein. More goes out in your stool, so we would up at 10% and say probably 0.9 grams per kilogram body weight. Children need more. They'll need, 1, 1.2, 1.4, depending on how young they are. And so we need to be more conscious, because children quite often, they like to eat their pasta, they like to eat their bread, they like to eat their crackers, and they may not like to eat their beans as much. And so we need to be a little more, conscious about giving them good sources of protein. The other groups are athletes and seniors, believe it or not. So athletes require, if they're competitive athletes, somewhere usually between 1.2 or 1.3 and 1.7 or up to 1.9 grams of protein per kilogram body weight if they're competitive. And it's not usually much of an issue, because a lot of these athletes are eating 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day, so it's easy to get that amount of protein. But they do, especially if they're really conscious of weight and restricting calories a bit, then they do need to be somewhat more conscious. Now, for the seniors, what's happening with seniors is they are less able to break protein down into amino acids and absorb the protein into the bloodstream. So there are actually some countries saying that their national recommendations are for 25% higher protein intakes for seniors than for other adults. And why is this a problem? This is a problem because you take a man who's 40 years old and he's eating 2,800 calories, and he's getting 20% of his calories from protein. He's eating 140 grams of calories from protein. You eat a man, or you look at a man who's, and this is a lot of protein, 20%. This is not 10 or 15. But you take a man who's 80, and he's eating 20% of calories from protein, but he's only eating 1,600 calories. His protein intake could be 80 grams, which is what is recommended for seniors by a lot of countries now. So, but it means that if they're eating a smaller number of calories, they need to be including more of those legumes and protein-rich foods in their diet, the seeds and so forth. Iron deficiency is a really common myth in the nutrition world, that vegetarians are somehow at greatly increased risk. In fact, if you look at the research, vegetarians and vegans aren't really at increased risk for iron deficiency. Now, I do see iron, the vegetarians that I see iron deficiency in are the vegetarians that are usually lacto-ovo, and they're consuming a lot of their calories from dairy. Dairy is a very poor source of iron. And it's also, it actually inhibits the absorption of iron. So it's like a double whammy. So people that, we see this sometimes, people switching from a meat and potatoes diet to, pizza with cheese and macaroni and cheese and grilled cheese sandwiches, because those are comfortable, familiar foods for them. And so they can end up with problems with iron when you do that. But for most vegetarians and vegans, what's really surprising to people is vegans actually consume more iron than omnivores. Almost everything they eat has iron, whereas dairy has so little iron, when it takes a chunk of your calories, it adds up to less than what you would think. So no, there's not more iron deficiency. However, we still need to be conscious about iron. And so there are a few things that people need to know. Oh, and there's one other thing I want to say. There's a difference between the type of iron in plants and the type of iron in animals. So the type of iron in animals, there are actually two types, heme and non-heme. So probably about 40% of the iron in animal products is heme iron, which is the iron associated with blood. Okay, and then the rest will be non-heme. And in plants, it's all non-heme. Well, non-heme iron is absorbed very differently than heme iron. So your body has a filter for for non-heme iron. It's absorbed more slowly. Some types of heme iron, like ferritin, it's absorbed in this molecule with 1,000 or more atoms of iron. And that iron is released slowly as your body needs it, which is it's a protection for the body, really. Whereas heme iron, there's no filter. It just gets absorbed, floods your body, and if you end up with a lot of heme iron in your blood, it can actually act as a pro-oxidant, which is, of course, the exact opposite of an antioxidant, which we want a lot of. And the pro-oxidant can actually accelerate rates of certain types of diseases. So it can increase your risk for things like heart disease and diabetes and stroke and other diseases, even dementia. So there are some advantages to getting our iron from plants. And with that having been said, a couple more things for people to know. The sort of richest iron sources would be things like legumes, of course. Lentils are a good source, and other legumes as well. We get some from nuts and seeds. We get some from some dried fruits. We get some from, blackstrap molasses if you use it, and of course from green vegetables. And so you get little bits from all sorts of foods, but the major source is legumes. And so the other thing to know is that you can reduce the absorption of non-heme iron by about 50 to 90% by consuming a lot of what we call phytates or tannins with your meal. Phytates, most concentrated source is wheat bran. So, some people sprinkle bran on their cereal to get the extra fiber. Vegetarians and vegans should never do that. You get plenty of fiber in your diet if you're eating whole plant foods. You don't need to sprinkle phytates on your food because we want to enhance the absorption of iron and zinc, not diminish the absorption of these nutrients. And then tannins, which would come from teas, even some herbal teas, but mainly black and green teas. And when you drink those with your meal, you inhibit the absorption of iron. So if you have any concerns about iron, you would want to keep your tea drinking an hour or two before or after meals rather than drinking it with your meals. And then the other thing to know is there's some things that actually enhance the absorption of iron. And the main ones we know about are organic acids and vitamin C. And vitamin C can increase the absorption of iron 2 to 6 times. Don't have the sort of organic acids well quantified yet, but also some phytochemical components from turmeric and ginger and even carotenoids. And these things can actually help with the absorption of iron as well. We are taught from the time we're very young that milk builds strong bones. And there is no question that cow's milk is a very rich source of calcium. You get about 300 milligrams of calcium per cup of cow's milk. Interestingly, you get about 600 milligrams from a cup of moose milk or a cup of deer milk. It doesn't make them essential foods for humans. So just because cow's milk, you see, every species produces a milk to support the growth of their offsprings. And if they're large animals with big bones, of course their milk's going to be very rich in calcium. You need a lot for building bones. And so it doesn't, we're not saying cow's milk isn't a rich source. Of course it is, but it's not an essential source of it's not an essential food for humans any more than moose or deer milk, as I said. But what you need to know is during the Paleolithic period, for millennia, human beings seemed to amble along reasonably well without a single drop of milk. They were consuming between 1,000 and 2,000 milligrams of calcium a day. And they were getting most of it from leafy greens, which they ate constantly. And so we can too. It's just, to get enough calcium from kale, you'd need to eat 11 cups. And so not everybody would eat 11 cups of kale. So we need to be looking at what are all the sources. And so you can get calcium from low oxalate leafy greens. So you get a little bit from high oxalate greens, but you only absorb about 5%. So if you look on a chart and you see, 200 and whatever milligrams of calcium in spinach, you're only getting about 5% of that. So spinach is not a good source of calcium, nor is Swiss chard, nor are beet greens. These very high oxalate greens are not reliable calcium sources because you can't absorb this stuff. It's bound to oxalates. Whereas the low oxalate greens, like the kale and the Chinese greens and the broccoli and all of those greens, the turnip greens and so forth, you can absorb 40 to 70% of the calcium. Now, we absorb about 32% of the calcium from cow's milk. Some would say 34, somewhere in there. You absorb about the same amount from tofu. You absorb just a little bit less from soy milk. From beans, you absorb, maybe 25%. So we absorb, varying amounts from different plant foods, but generally you can get enough when you include a variety of those foods eaten throughout the course of the day. And for people that have a really hard time getting up to the sort of 1,000 or, the RDA is 1,000 milligrams up to the age of 50 for women and 70 for men. After 50 for women, after 70 for men, it's 1,200. And so for that age category, to meet those RDAs, some people, what they do is add a cup or two of a non-dairy milk that's fortified. And so that's an option of boosting your intake quite easily. So 1 cup has the exact same amount of calcium as a cup of cow's milk, about 300 milligrams. And so that's an option for people that just want to boost their intake a little bit. But it is absolutely possible to get enough without doing that. But you do need to be conscious about your choices. So for example, if you're eating fruit, oranges, dried figs are better calcium choices than would be an apple or, some other dried fruit. So if you're looking at, with the calcium-rich foods within each group, the legumes, and then within the nuts and seeds, the more calcium-rich choices would be almonds or sesame seeds. And so it's, just choosing carefully within each food group, and you can do it. Oh, and I have to say, now that we're talking about calcium, I like to tell my little story because we have a lot of osteoporosis in my family. My mom developed osteoporosis by the time she was 50. And so when I was nearing 50, I thought, I wonder if I should see where I stand. And my doctor said, absolutely, we need to do a complete, the gold standard bone density, complete DEXA scan or whatever. And so he said, you've been vegan for many years. You don't, you're not drinking milk. You've got the family history. You're small, Caucasian female. You're at very high risk. And when my results came back, I can still remember his face when he opened my chart to give me the results. And his jaw dropped, and he went, he couldn't believe it. He said, I'm absolutely stunned. Your bone density is 2.5 standard deviations above norm for your age. And it's, for your, I think it was for my femur, and 2 standard deviations above norm for my age, for my spine. And he said, that's almost unheard of. He said, I don't know what you're doing, but whatever you're doing, keep doing it. And the moral of that story is even as a vegan, you can have exceptional bone health if you're conscious about, I'm conscious about, and bone health isn't just about calcium, by the way. It's about vitamin C and vitamin K, and it's about vitamin E, and it's about essential fatty acids and many other nutrients, magnesium and potassium, and all of these things play a role in building strong. Even protein. We need to get enough protein to build the bone matrix. All of that matters. But what may matter even more than all of that is exercise, weight-bearing exercise. And I've been an exercise enthusiast since I was a teenager. I do exercise pretty much every day unless I'm really sick or on the plane somewhere, but even if I'm traveling. So I'm taking a flight somewhere. I don't use the escalators, I use the stairs, and I try to walk as much as I can within the airport. And so there are ways that you can kind of build exercise into your day. When I'm at hotels, I walk the stairs instead of taking the elevators as much as possible. So I think there are ways of doing that, and I really think that's what has helped my bones to be what they are. And so I'm grateful for that, but just know that you can do it. Being vegan doesn't mean that you'll be sacrificing your bones. So high oxalate greens are greens that have this higher content of this compound we call oxalates. And these oxalates bind with, or they're really oxalic acid bound with calcium or iron or whatever it is, and making the minerals unavailable for absorption. And so oxalates increase, when we consume a lot, can increase our risk of kidney stones. And kidney stones are not good news for anyone that's ever experienced them. Just not good news. So what I would suggest is it's okay to consume high oxalate greens if you're not at high risk for kidney stones. It's okay to consume some in the mix, but I wouldn't make my primary greens high oxalate greens like spinach, Swiss chard, and beet greens. I would, mix them in with others, and I would generally eat them whole rather than juicing them. And the reason is you can eat probably 10 times and even higher than normal oxalate intakes when you juice, because you're eating so many greens. And so I would say stick more to the low oxalate greens for juicing. And if you're eating them, eat them in a salad or something like that. So one of the big concerns about plant-based diets is where do we get our long-chain omega-3s? 40% of the gray matter of the brain or so, maybe even more, is DHA. And when we think about DHA and EPA, so just stepping back a little bit, there are two essential fatty acids, linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid, and alpha-linolenic acid, which is an omega-3 fatty acid. We must have both. We can't manufacture them in our bodies. We have to have both, and we have to get them from the diet. Simple as that. We get plenty of omega-6s because omega-6s, grains, the main fats are omega-6s. Many of our seeds, like poppy seeds and sesame seeds and pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds, are mainly omega-6s. And so we get lots of omega-6s. The oils that are used in processed foods are largely omega-6s. And so sunflower oil, safflower oil, corn oil are all mainly omega-6s. And so omega-3s can be a little bit more of a problem. And omega-3s come from, or the alpha-linolenic acid or parent omega-3, the plant omega-3, comes from flax seeds and chia seeds and hemp seeds and walnuts. About half of the fat in green leafy vegetables is omega-3 as well. But there's so little fat in greens, you would have to eat, 20 to 30 cups of them to get enough. So what happens in vegans is you need to take these plant omega-3s, and through a series of desaturation and elongation, you would convert them into EPA, or otherwise known as eicosapentaenoic acid, or DHA, which the long version is docosahexaenoic acid. These fats are very biologically active. They're extremely important in the brain, the eyes, in the cell membranes of the human body. And so we need them. Now, these fats are highly unstable. They're the most unsaturated fats in the human diet. And so they need to be treated with some care as well. But the conversion, our ability to convert, take the plant form, turn it into the biologically active form, and to get back to those biologically active forms, the EPA gets converted into something we call eicosanoids, prostaglandins, prostacyclins, leukotrienes, thromboxanes, these kinds of things. And the DHA and EPA also can get converted into other compounds like we call them resolvins and protectins. And these are just hugely important in the human body and protective. And so we need these things. So vegans generally have lower levels in their bodies, maybe a third to a half at most compared to omnivores. Vegetarians a little more because they get some DHA from eggs, from egg yolks. But generally, people eating plant-based make less and have lower levels in their bodies. And so there's a couple of ways they can overcome that. One is to make sure you get enough alpha-linolenic acid. So you're eating enough of the flax and chia and hemp and so on, and you're not eating too much omega-6, because the omega-6s and omega-3s, that linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid, compete for the conversion enzymes. So if you get too much omega-6, the omega-6 will win out. So we need to make sure we have a reasonable balance if we're plant-based. And then the second thing we can do is to make sure we're getting the nutrients we need, because conversion requires that we be nutritionally replete in a number of nutrients. So we just have to be cautious of having a balanced diet. And then the other things that we need to do, not smoking, not drinking too much, all of those things can depress desaturase enzymes as well. So, and then people that their heritage is a sort of fish-eating populations, island people or Japanese, they may not make as many conversion enzymes. So their levels may be low as well because they lack conversion enzymes. So for some people, they would be well advised to consume direct sources of EPA and DHA. So a lot of people think that means I need to eat fish. And actually, again, it's sort of another similar story to the essential fatty acids. Essential amino acids in plants. The essential fatty acids are these long chain fatty acids are actually made by microalgae in the ocean. So fish get them at some point along the food chain from microalgae. And so what's happening now is manufacturers are actually culturing the microalgae and extracting the DHA and EPA. And so we can purchase it as supplements. They're adding it to some oils and other things as well. But we can purchase the stuff without raping the oceans. There have been estimates that by 2050, we will have fished out all of the fish in the oceans. Basically, the fish stocks will be either what do we call endangered or threatened or whatever, or extinct completely. And so there's concern about how we're taking fish stocks. And so when you think about that, it makes such sense. Also when you culture it, you're not at risk for any of the persistent organic pollutants that move up the food chain. You're not at risk for the mercury and the other heavy metals that can contaminate fish and seaweed. And so it makes sense to get it that way. And the other thing is when you consume huge amounts of fish oil, these again are very highly unstable fats. You flood your body with what is not physiologically a kind of natural amount to be consuming. Your body may not be able to deal with it, and some of it may get oxidized. And so these smaller amounts you get from the microalgae supplements, 200 or 300 milligrams a day, I think your body could deal with quite easily. So I think it's a good plan. So who needs it? Well, I would say the people that aren't converting well. So people with diabetes, hypertension may be well advised to take it. People that come from fish-eating populations may be well advised to take it. Pregnant and lactating women may want to boost their levels because they're growing a new baby brain. And so that's, those are populations. Would everybody need it? We don't really know. But it might make sense for people to take it even 2 or 3 times a week to kind of keep their levels a little bit above what we see in the average vegan population. The question is about a raw vegan versus a conventional vegan diet, and are there advantages, potential advantages to raw? And I would say there are possibly advantages in sort of both camps, but the main advantages for raw is when you do a raw food diet, you're eliminating 2 categories of foods. You're eliminating animal products and processed foods. When you do a vegan diet, you're eliminating animal foods. You may not necessarily be eliminating processed foods. So the raw diet would be, it tends to be a very clean diet, often organic and no processed foods. So you're not getting all of the additives and preservatives and artificial sweeteners and the white flour and all of that's gone. And so this is a potentially very highly therapeutic diet if it's designed properly. Now, a whole food plant-based diet where you're doing the other thing about the raw diet is you're minimizing your intake of the products of oxidation that occur with cooking. And that's potentially quite a huge benefit because we're looking at, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, advanced glycation end products, the acrylamide and other products, if you're especially cooking with oil, that you would form the acrylenes and so on, aldehydes that form with cooking oils. And so definitely some huge advantages in that direction. Now, a conventional vegan diet, if it's a whole food plant-based diet where you're not frying foods, you're not adding sugars, you're not using white flour, and the way that you cook foods is you steam your vegetables or you're doing things very consciously in those ways, then that diet would be much more comparable to a raw food diet. Absolutely. We actually have really truckloads of evidence at this point that plant-based diets may offer significant advantage in terms of disease risk reduction. And some of the most powerful studies that I've seen are studies that compare populations that researchers have been following for many years. And within these populations, they're comparing similar health conscious individuals who eat different dietary patterns. So within the health conscious cohort, you have health conscious meat eaters, health conscious semi-vegetarians, health conscious fish eaters, health conscious lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and health conscious vegans. And they're controlled for exercise, smoking, alcohol intake. You know, all of these confounding variables are being controlled for. So we're isolating out the differences between eating meat and eating plants, for example. So there are really three studies that are ongoing. The two biggest are the Adventist Health Study 2, 96,000 participants, began in 2002 and is ongoing. The second, and that's in North America. And the second is Epic Oxford in the UK, about 65,000 individuals, began in, I think it was 1992 or 93, and it's ongoing. So it's been going on for a long, long time. The third is a smaller cohort of about maybe 4,400 individuals in Taiwan. And they're comparing similar health conscious Buddhists who are omnivores versus Buddhists who are vegetarians. And so we're just starting to see the results of those studies as well. And so when we look at these studies and look at the differences, what we see is in terms of mortality, we see reduced mortality among vegans. The greatest risk reduction was for vegan men, by far, much greater risk reduction than anyone else. And vegans on the whole, I think it was about 15% risk reduction in mortality. And then for heart disease, a 32% risk reduction for Epic Oxford. For men in the Adventist Health Study 2, it was about a 42% risk reduction, a 55% risk reduction for ischemic heart disease. And for women, not any significant differences for vegan or lacto-ovo-vegetarian women compared to the health-conscious omnivorous. But then for hypertension, for both men and women, 75% less hypertension among vegans, 55% among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. In Epic Oxford, slightly lower numbers in Adventist Health Study 2, slightly lower numbers for Epic Oxford, but similar. And I think about a 31% difference in the Taiwanese study. And then if we look at diabetes, 62% less in vegans. I think it was 38% less in lacto-ovo-vegetarians. And that was Adventist Health Study 2. Cataracts, 40% lower for vegans, 30% lower for lacto-ovo-vegetarians. That was in Epic Oxford. And then cancer, in Epic Oxford, it was 19% lower for vegans and about 11% for vegetarians. And then in Adventist Health Study 2, it was 16% for vegans and 8% for lacto-ovo-vegetarians. And then for diverticular disease, it was 72% lower for vegans, 27% lower for lacto-ovo-vegetarians. And then the other one that we've got some data on is kidney disease, 52% lower for lacto-ovo-vegetarians and vegans combined. And that was Adventist Health Study 2 in Epic Oxford, a very recent study showing a 31% risk reduction in kidney stones for people eating plant-based. So yes, we have some evidence, and it's a very sound evidence. And you know what's really interesting is the entire cohort is at half the risk of has half the risk of mortality compared to the general population. So imagine how much bigger those numbers would be if we weren't comparing to health conscious, controlling for body weight and for exercise and all of those things. The numbers would be much greater. So we're not comparing to the general population. We're comparing to very similar omnivores. And so it's very compelling research. And the other thing to remember is that the people in Epic Oxford and the people in the Adventist Health Study 2, they're not eating truly whole food plant-based diets. They're not eating raw food diets. They're eating, the Adventists eat diets that have a lot of meat analogs and a lot of bread and a lot of, processed foods, really, a lot of processed. And it's the same, and they eat way better or significantly better, more fruits and vegetables than the Epic Oxford people. So imagine what the numbers would be if we were looking at people eating truly whole food plant-based diets. So there's, I think, some pretty sound, convincing evidence there. Reversal of heart disease is so interesting because there was a time where we believed once plaque was laid down, nothing could change that it would just continue to get worse and worse and worse until the lifestyle heart trial in 1990. And Dean Ornish did a study where he used a low-fat plant-based diet, about 10% fat, stress management, group therapy, exercise, and 82% of his group, his experimental group, actually had reversal. And what was really interesting is these people were basically people who were told by their doctors, you're done. There's nothing more we can do for you. We've done the triple bypasses. Get your affairs in order. You're going to be gone within a year. And 12, 14, 18, 20 years later, they're still doing well. And so this was really earth-shattering. And then not so long after, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, who will be here speaking as well, did his research, and actually with Dean Ornish's, his experimental group 5 years later had 2.5 times fewer cardiac events than the control group that was doing, the sort of standard of care American Heart Association diet. But with Dr. Esselstyn, nobody that stuck to his program had recurrence. Nobody. And he came out with another study in 2014 where I think 0.6% of the people sticking to his diet had recurrence, and 62 or 63% of the people in the control, or it wasn't a control. It was the people that didn't follow the diet that 62% actually had an event. So this is really quite astounding. I don't know of any diets that have ever shown cardiac disease or heart disease reversal. And so this is important. And we can't underestimate the value of this. And, I've had, talking to physicians, I have the privilege of talking to physicians quite often. And I've had physicians say to me, and on a regular basis, I believe you, but I don't think my patients would ever do that. And so one of the things that I like to remind them of is what their responsibility as a physician really is. And their responsibility is to lay the options out on the table. Of course your patients won't do it if they don't even know about it. It's so important not to be paternalistic and to assume you know what your patient will or will not do. You don't. I can remember working in a cardiology clinic years ago. It was probably 25 years ago, and there was this big truck driver that came in. He must have been 300 pounds. And I remember thinking to myself, this guy was going to be dead in 5 years. He was in his 30s. And I thought his cholesterol and triglycerides were so high. And so I thought, he was eating a hot beef sandwich with gravy and French fries and pop for lunch and dinner pretty much every day. That's the truck stops. That's what they served. That's what he ate. And I can remember thinking to myself, like, why should I waste my breath? There's no way this guy's going to do anything. But I thought to myself, you need to lay his options out. So I told him that you can do a low-fat plant-based diet and see a reduction of, Dean Ornish, on average, it was 37% reduction in cholesterol and reversal of disease. Or you could do a Heart Association kind of diet that's, 20 to 30% of calories from fat and low saturated fat and so on and so forth. And you'll get a 5% reduction in cholesterol, and you'll be on medication for the rest of your life. Or you can continue doing as you're doing and die. It's really your choice. And he looked at me and he said, why would I do anything other than what would give me the very best chance of survival? I don't want to die. I'm 35 years old. And it was it hit me. that we cannot decide for our patients what they are or are not willing to do. All we can do is lay out those options, and we need to let them know what is possible. Because when people make these choices, it is absolutely life-changing. You can rebuild your body. Your body wants to heal itself. It will do everything in its power if you put the right tools in your mouth, the building blocks to rebuild your body properly, and magic will happen. And so people need to know about that. They've got to know. And so we just have to have the courage to tell them and then let them decide. We can't decide for them. But they're the captains of their own ship. I'm a dietitian, physicians. We can't eat, we can't exercise for anybody. They're the only ones that can do that. All we can do is tell them what's possible. So I think that's really, really important. And yes, heart disease is absolutely reversible. No, I don't. And with all due respect to my absolutely cherished colleagues, Dr. Esselstyn, Dr. Ornish, and others that are promoting a very low-fat plant-based diet, I believe that the research shows definitively that these diets work for reversing heart disease. And there's a little bit of research even with diabetes that they may be effective for that as well. But I think what people need to understand is just because a diet is effective for a very sick person to reverse heart disease, that works to reverse heart disease, does not make it the gold standard for everyone. I think it's risky to use a very low-fat diet for young children, even for athletes. Fat is actually important. It's important for our brains, and our eyes, our cell membranes, for all of those things. Fat also, it's what provides us with our essential fatty acids. Some of the very low-fat diets aren't providing enough essential fats. Also, it's very important for the absorption of fat-soluble nutrients. So, for example, vitamin A, carotenoids, vitamin E, vitamin D, these kinds of nutrients, many phytochemicals are fat-soluble. And in order to absorb them, we need to have some fat. So, let's say, for example, some people just pour a sugar dressing on their salad. They'll buy a fat-free dressing and think it's all healthy. Well, you'll absorb, a fraction of the phytochemicals from your salad that you would if you put a tahini-based dressing or a hemp seed-based dressing on your salad. So I think I actually believe, and I think the evidence is pretty clear, that nuts and seeds are protective, avocados are protective, that some of these higher fat plant foods are very, very beneficial. And the other thing is sometimes when people shift to a very low-fat plant-based diet, and they're not conscious of refined carbohydrates. They end up eating a lot of refined carbohydrates. Their triglycerides go up, their HDL goes down, and they can actually increase risk by doing that. So people need to be careful. And the other thing I've seen, which is people choosing foods on the basis of whether or not it contains fat. So they would choose a loaf of white bread over a loaf of bread with flax seeds because flax seeds have fat and fat's bad. So there's it's sort of an extreme example, but I've actually seen that in people. If something's fat-free, it must be good. So there's the fat-free Snackwell's cookies or whatever, and they must be good. And so I think we need to be cautious. So to me, the World Health Organization recommends a minimum of 15% of calories from fat. And I think for the average healthy individual, that's a really good starting point, because at 15%, then you'll be ensuring sufficient absorption of these protective nutrients and enough essential fatty acids. So I would say 15 to 25 is probably a good range when the fat is coming from whole plant foods, higher fat whole plant foods. Well, cancer is tricky. So one of the things, let's say you had 100 people with colon cancer. And you divided, you put half on conventional treatment, you gave them chemo, radiation, whatever they need. And the other half you said, well, we're going to put you on green juices and you're going to do this diet. It would never pass any ethical board, because basically you've got what is considered the evidence-based standard, their standard of care. And so you couldn't just use an unproven therapy for these other people that might die if they don't receive this treatment. So that makes it really difficult. However, we have evidence that people consuming plant-based diets have less DNA damage, better DNA repair. They have fewer toxic metabolites in their stools. They have better gut microflora. They have better, lower levels of inflammation, lower levels of IGF-1. So all of these factors that are kind of cancer promoters are reduced. So that's some decent evidence. And then the other evidence that I think is among the most compelling bits of evidence we have is from Dean Ornish again. So after he finished his cardiovascular disease research, he went on to prostate cancer research. In 2005, he did a study that showed that PSA levels on people doing plant-based were reduced about 4%. And well, first of all, he had a group of men who chose not to get treatment for their very slow-growing prostate cancer. And so, he put, I think 49 of them on just control, and 44 went on this lifestyle program. And the ones that went on the lifestyle program, their PSA decreased. The ones that were doing nothing, their PSA increased. After a year, 6 of the people that were in the control group actually had to start treatment because their disease had progressed sufficiently that they felt they needed to start therapy. And then the other thing that was very cool was the serum of the people on the plant-based diet killed 70%. 70% more cancer cells than the people in the 70%. Yeah, it was 70% versus some other percent of cancer cells that were killed, and so it was 8 times more is what it was than the people in the control group. So very, very interesting. And then he went on to prove that you could actually change the expression of your genes by doing plant-based for just 3 months. He reported it was about 453, I think close to 500 cancer-promoting genes that were downregulated, and about 48 cancer-preventing genes that were upregulated by going on a plant-based diet. Unbelievable. This was earth-shattering. We can change the expression of our genes. And then he went on to show in 2013 that you could actually change the length of your telomeres by eating a healthy diet. So telomeres are the ends of the chromosomes that sort of tell you how long you're going to live. And normally, as you get older, they just shrink and shrink and shrink. Well, adopting a healthy lifestyle, and they actually start to get bigger. And so this was, again, it was pretty earth-shattering. So he's done some work that would give us indication that adopting a plant-based diet could be a very effective strategy for cancer treatment, even if you're doing it in conjunction with conventional treatment. It can do nothing but good. And the answer is a very, very clear yes. So we have several dozen studies. Even I looked at studies between 1994 and 2008, and there were 24 studies. And it's very consistent. They both are very highly protective against cancer, but raw vegetables are more protective. And there are several reasons for that. Number one is that they're higher in phytochemicals. Number two is that when you cook vegetables, you change the effect of the fiber in the food. And that can alter the effect they have on your gastrointestinal system. Number three is raw vegetables contain enzymes that convert phytochemicals into their active forms. And so one of those enzymes is called myrosinase in cruciferous vegetables, and it actually turns on phase 2 enzymes, which help to change carcinogens into water-soluble compounds so we can excrete them from the body. So for example, in cruciferous vegetables, you have these compounds called glucosinolates that get converted into isothiocyanates like sulforaphane, and sulforaphane is needed in this, kicks in this phase 2 enzyme system. So that's another reason that raw vegetables may provide some advantage. And of course, when you cook, you lose some nutrients that may be cancer-fighting nutrients as well. So there are several reasons why raw foods may provide an advantage over, or do provide an advantage over cooked. Both, the more vegetables you eat, the better you do. But raw are more powerful in terms of cancer prevention than cooked. And we do. We have actually the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine did a few reasonably small studies, but following people for a good period of time, showing that what they actually did was used a low-fat vegan diet, and their control was people doing an American Diabetes Association diet. And actually both diets showed benefits in terms of insulin resistance and lowering blood glucose levels and A1Cs and body weight and cholesterol and all of those things. But the vegan diet consistently did better than the American Diabetes Association diet. So we have those studies. We have some studies out of the Czech Republic, a study from 2014, I think it was, showing, again, comparing a vegetarian diet, and the only animal product they used was 1 serving of yogurt, low-fat yogurt per day. Otherwise, there were no animal products in the diet. And in that study, again, they found that and they compared it to the conventional diabetic diet, that the vegetarian diet did better on every single count. And then the work that I've actually been doing, some work in the Marshall Islands, where and we're just writing it up now, but we actually found very significant advantages to doing plant-based as well. The Marshall Islands, for those people that aren't familiar with the Marshall Islands, they're a small group of many islands in the South Pacific, or in the Pacific, about 2,300 miles southwest of Hawaii. So it's sort of a strategic location. Some people may remember Bikini Island being atomic bomb testing grounds after the Second World War. But anyway, the Marshallese people went from having absolutely no diabetes 100 years ago to having among the highest rates in the world. And they literally went from living off the land where they were eating coconut and green leaves and whatever taro root and bananas and fish, whatever fish they could catch with their little spears, to living off of having more people on the islands than what the islands could sustain. So the main island, Madro, has 30,000 people. It might sustain 1,000 if we were lucky. So they have to import food. And so what they import is, because people are very poor and there's not a great economy, is the cheapest food you can think of. So they import things like turkey tails and spam and the parts of the animals we don't want. So because they're cheap. White rice, sticky rice, luau, which is high fructose corn syrup drink. Lots of ramen, so they eat dry ramen noodles and they sprinkle Kool-Aid powder on top to make it taste good. The kids do. It's really, I couldn't design a diet to induce diabetes that would be more efficient than the diet they've adopted. And it's just so sad because they are, it's like a second home to me. I've been there maybe 10 times now. And I stayed the first time I was there 8 months, and I worked on a diabetes research project, and I continue to go back on a regular basis. But they are just absolutely the most beautiful people. The way they laugh, the way they enjoy every moment together, and they tease one another and they sing, and you never feel judged. You can walk down the street and sing to the top of your lungs, and people just start singing with you. It's a beautiful place, and so it really saddens me to see people suffering the way they're suffering so needlessly. And so we went in and we did this control group, usual care, and fairly aggressive whole food plant-based diet. And we saw average blood sugar drops of 70 points within 2 weeks. We saw average A1C drops of 2 points within 12 weeks. We saw A1Cs, HSCRPs down by about 1.2 points. So we saw some really big changes. And even going back, like last year when I went back, or 2016 when I went back, we actually had blood glucose drops of over 100 points on average. So we're getting better and better at what we're doing there, and seeing better and better results. And we saw several people who were able to completely reverse their diabetes. And it's very, very encouraging to see. And what's happening now is that the government is so interested in helping the people that I just went a couple of months ago, 2 months ago in November of 2017, along with a colleague, to create a program that would a new curriculum for schools from kindergarten to grade 6, so that the teachers, and we trained all the teachers in the public schools while we were there, so that the kids could start to learn. They've got new rules, new laws, where people are not allowed to sell unhealthy foods near the schools, in the schools anymore. So we're working on things, and we're seeing changes. When I first arrived, nobody walked anywhere, because walking showed you were too poor to afford a 25-cent taxi, and so people just didn't walk. And now people walking in the mornings. There's walkathons all the time, and the restaurants have diabetes wellness approved menu options, and the stores are having way more produce than they used to, and they're carrying some of them have little health sections now where they sell flax seeds and steel cut oats and things like that. So we're really seeing some very encouraging changes. It's quite wonderful. Yeah, so to me, number one is you need the foundation of your diet to be whole plant foods. And that is critical. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, you want 10 servings of vegetables and fruits. You want 2 or 3 servings of legumes. You want to make sure you've got a serving of nuts and seeds, or 2, like at least 1 of nuts, 1 of seeds, and make sure there's an omega-3 rich source. If you're eating, grains are a little bit optional depending on your caloric needs, but you want them to be mainly intact. You want lots of herbs and spices because they're loaded with phytochemicals and antioxidants. So that's number one, whole plant foods. Number 2, you want to make sure that you're getting up in terms of the amount of fiber you're eating. And you do that just by eating that number of whole plant foods. And the number 1 source of fiber, of course, is beans. And so including some legumes is a really, really good idea. The average person's eating 15 grams, 20 grams at most of fiber a day. We probably need more in the range of at least 35 to 50 for optimal health. Paleolithic people ate 70 to 150 grams of fiber a day. So that's number 2. Number 3 is be very picky about your sources of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, you not only do you want to make sure you're not consuming refined carbohydrates. So when we say refined carbohydrates, we're talking about both complex and simple carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates being sugars, so soda pop and candy and white sugar and brown sugar and honey and all concentrated sweeteners. Refined, well, honey wouldn't be refined, but generally sugars that are concentrated, even agave syrup. And then on the complex carbohydrates, the refined complex carbohydrates are the white flour products, the white rice products, so the concentrated starches. And both of those are consistently associated with increased disease risk, increased risk of overweight and obesity. You can't stop eating them, and they're addictive. And so we just need to get rid of those foods as much as is possible. And then the next thing is, a lot of people will say, well, whole grains are fine. So I eat all whole wheat bread, and I eat, puffed rice, and I eat my flaked organic kamut flakes or whatever. And people also need to understand that there's a hierarchy within the whole grain world. And I created this sort of hierarchy of whole grains to help people understand that just because it's a whole grain doesn't mean it's not highly processed. Okay, so you can take and make whole grain flour, but then you're making, the muffins or cupcakes or whatever with the whole grain flour. You've still added a bunch of fat and sugar and salt, and what we do when we make foods out of flour is add things to make it taste good. And so in the whole grain hierarchy, at the top of the hierarchy is intact whole grains. Then next would be cut whole grains like steel cut oats. Then next on the hierarchy would be rolled whole grains like rolled oats. Then next would be the shredded whole grains, then ground, then flaked, then puffed at the bottom. And when the puffing process is, you put a grain under, so much pressure that you puff it. Well, as you go down the hierarchy, you digest and absorb these things faster. You increase the surface area, so it increases your blood glucose more. You decrease the nutritional value because you're exposing the food to air and just all of these processing techniques. And so we want to, as much as possible, stay higher on that whole grain hierarchy. So that's number 3, is choosing carbohydrates. Number 4 is with protein. Stick to plant protein as much as is possible. And again, you want to be sticking mainly to beans, lentils, peas, these intact sort of legumes that have all the fiber and phytochemicals and all of that, and choosing less often the more highly processed options. Now, there's a lot of controversy about soy, so I'll just say I haven't said anything about soy. I'll say a few words about soy. To me, the acid test is to look at the healthiest, longest-lived populations on the planet. 2 populations, the Okinawans and the Seventh-day Adventists, that are blue zone populations, include soy as a dietary staple. The Okinawans consuming 2 servings a day, and the Adventists consuming, I'm not sure, they haven't quantified it, but soy is a part of their regular daily diet. And so if it is a staple in the longest-lived peoples, it's probably not poison. But what people need to understand is that we want to be choosing, I would choose organic, and I would choose soy that's less processed. So edamame, soybeans, and tofu or tempeh is not super highly processed, rather than the sort of veggie meats, which are more highly processed, which I'm not saying you can never include, but should be less often. And so, plant-based protein foods have huge advantages over animal-based protein foods, and I won't get into that too much, but just know, and I think you've heard it probably from Dr. Furman quite a lot, there's so many problems with meat in comparison to legumes. I have a kind of a list where I have them side by side, and there's so many advantages to legume. And if we look at mortality, the studies on mortality show that even the tiniest bit of legume consumption, 2/3 of an ounce a day, decreases mortality by 7 to 8%. Whereas with meat, it's the exact opposite. Meat increases mortality consistent across the board. So that's number 4, protein. Number 5, we'd be talking about fat. And again, get your fat from whole foods. Rather than, I look at oils, to me, oils are to the fat world as sugars are to the carbohydrate world. With carbohydrates, when people get their carbohydrates from whole foods, they're at no increased risk of disease. They're at a decreased risk of disease. And it's the same with fats. I think that with fats, we want to get them mainly from whole foods, nuts, seeds, avocados, and these kinds of higher fat foods, rather than from oils, which are highly refined foods. And so that, and making sure we have that source of omega-3. We need 2 to 4 grams a day. We would get that from eating a tablespoon of flax seeds. We would get that ground flax seeds, because you're not going to absorb it from intact flax seeds. A couple of tablespoons of hemp seeds, a tablespoon and a half of chia seeds, an ounce of walnuts would provide that. So that's, and with fats, you want to, absolutely eliminate trans fats. You want to minimize saturated fats. So maybe 5-6% of calories is what the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology suggest. The only people that are in that realm are vegans. So that's bottom line. It's not hard to be in that range on a vegan diet. And we want to avoid damaged fats. So fats that are heated to high temperatures, and also even storing nuts and seeds. We want to store nuts and seeds in the fridge or refrigerator. So what I do when I buy nuts or seeds is, so I get, my 5 kilos or 10 pounds of walnuts or pumpkin seeds or whatever. I always buy them in volume. The first thing I do is soak them for overnight or for a few hours, whatever it is, dehydrate them in the dehydrator, and then I put them in little containers and freeze them. I take them out as I need them, and that's how I deal with nuts and seeds. And so I think that was number 5. Number 6 would be to minimize exposure to environmental contaminants. So we're wanting to minimize our exposure to persistent organic pollutants like dioxins and all of these pollutants that move up the food chain, and mercury and the heavy metals and all of these agrochemicals, pesticides and herbicides and growth regulators and all of these things. So how do we do that? Well, 2 ways. Eat lower on the food chain and eat organic. So it's really as simple as that. Next on the list would be to really reduce the toxic compounds that are formed from cooking. And so we're talking about heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and advanced glycation end products and acrylamide and all of these compounds which are potentially neurotoxic, carcinogenic, and so we just need to be aware of those. And so how do we deal with that? Don't eat fried foods. Just don't eat them. Don't fry with oil. Keep, if possible, keep oils out of cooking as much as possible. Just not using them. And then storing foods properly. So the nuts and seeds in the fridge and freezer and so forth. And I think that was number 7 or 8. Where will that we see? Around there. Anyway. And then the next on the list to me would be to maximize phytochemicals and antioxidants. And that means just eating the widest variety and the most colorful foods you can within each category. So in fruits and vegetables, I always say at least 3 green, 2 red, 2 purple, blue, 2 orange, yellow, and a few, even the white beige family with the onions and garlic and so forth. And so you want the whole range of the rainbow, but you want the variety. And not just in fruits and vegetables. Think about it when you're choosing beans, more of the red and black beans, more of the, even in grains, black rice or red or black quinoa instead of always choosing the brown, for example. And just the variety as well. So you don't want to be eating 6 apples a day as your fruits. You want to be including some berries and some citrus fruits, and it's the same in all categories. You want to be varying up your choices. And then and I'm not sure if I'm missing any, but the last one that I would say would be just don't overeat. Do not overeat. The Japanese with the hairy hachibu thing, eat till you're 80% full, is a really good plan. It's so hard to do in such an obesogenic environment where we have such foods that we can't resist all around us and people are offering, and that's how we show love and it's how we commune with our families, and it's so difficult. It's so difficult. And so we just need to be really conscious of not just the type of food we eat, but the quantity of food. So if we're eating a large volume, we want to eat a large volume of salad, not a large volume of garbage food. The other thing that to me is really important is not drinking sugar. That's one of the best things you can do for weight control, because people who are leaner have a much lower risk of any chronic disease and a greater longevity. So that's very, very important. So those are kind of I would say the top 10. If I did 10, I'm not sure if I did 9 or 10, but anyway, the top. And then I'll leave you with my, sort of final thought, and that is that, we have such power in our personal example. It's incredible. People, nobody, I think, we don't get through to anybody by spitting in their face. We need, in order to move people, we need to connect with them and love them and cherish the wonderful things that they're doing, and then share our example of good health, but also share delicious, wonderful food with a really generous heart. And I think that's the most important thing we can do to help other people shift, rather than waving a finger at them or telling them they're idiots or any of that. It doesn't bring us together. We need to be connecting with people with respect and with love, and that means sharing. It means sharing food, and it means just being generous. So that's what veganism is all about. It's about compassion. It's about wanting to make this world a more beautiful place, more ethical place, and it begins with how we treat our neighbors. So I'll leave you with that, and thank you so much.